Hello again. Welcome to your fourth and final video clip on Congress. This is going to be a short clip, and this takes on the idea of a different dimension of representation and what we might call representativeness. That is, what should Congress actually look like? We talk about how they might make decisions, trustee versus delegate model versus Politico model. But part of it is we often think of representation as um, that members of Congress are like us. And what do we mean by that? Are they like us in any number of descriptors? Do they do the kind of work we do? Do they believe in the kind of religion we do? Are they from my hometown? What is their race? What is their gender? And we have a variety of ways in which we think those things matter or do not matter along the way. This is a really interesting question. It may not seem like it at first, but it is an interesting question. And people have been thinking about this for a very long time. Even the founders thought about representation on this particular dynamic, in that they often made the argument that people were less likely to worry about that their representative did what they did, that were like them, and more likely to find a representative who was good at being at Congress. So that is, they would make the argument that farmers are smart enough to know not to elect another farmer to go represent them in Congress, because what the skills and stuff that it takes to be a farmer are not the same ones to negotiate and represent you politically and legally. But then maybe merchants would be. Merchants might have those skills, or lawyers might have those skills. And so if you're a farmer and you want to send someone to Congress to represent and defend you, you wouldn't pick another farmer. Just like if you're not a lawyer, you know, you won't go pick someone who does the job that you do to represent you in court. You go off and find someone who looks different than you that has a certain kind of skill set. So these are sort of interesting questions. And we're going to look at a couple different dynamics: geographically, where someone might live within a district or where they might be; descriptive, that is where they are; substantive, where they believe, right, etc., other areas. So we're just going to look at some of these demographics and give you an idea: does Congress actually look like the United States of America? Of course, one of the big ones in which we'd look at this, one of the two would be racial, the other one being gender. And in terms of race, Congress is overwhelmingly white, certainly disproportionately white in most dynamics than the rest of the United States. The House of Representatives is a little better off than in the Senate, but not heavily so in terms of race. We get an idea of what this looks like. The U.S. Senate in particular, we get an idea of what this looks like. Very few African Americans make up the U.S. Senate, or are members of the U.S. Senate. Handful of Hispanics, one Asian. There once was an American Indian who was a member of the Senate from Colorado, a guy named Ben Nighthorse Campbell, a Republican, who's no longer a member of the Senate. On the House of Representatives, we see a slightly, again, you got to look at percentages on this, but you see a slightly different breakdown in representation. And we've seen slow growth in most areas of representation and race, although it flattens out and stuff like that. But we don't see a lot of sort of backward trends in terms of how that stuff works. In terms of gender, too, we can see men and women breaking down on this. Of course, women make up an abysmally small proportion of the House of Representatives and the Senate compared to their position, compared to their numbers in society. Women make up slightly over 50% of the U.S. population, yet they, make up 20% or less of one of the two houses of Congress. Some other areas we want to look at is age, and there's a couple ways in which we can sort of look at this. One of the things you can see, obviously, right off the bat, is that members of the Senate tend to be older than the members of the House of Representatives, and this makes sense since being a senator is usually a more prestigious position that requires more skillful and longer-term political commitment. That is, you're likely to be in some other elected official position or multiple ones over time before you would have the name recognition and the skill to run for a Senate. But you get some idea. I find this interesting because the starting point and the ending point, looking at sort of where they go. So senators, it seems like, wow, the average senator is 62 years old, but when they're elected, they're 53 years old. So you get some kind of idea of how that looks. So the most newly elected senators are younger than the average member of the House of Representatives, but overall, the senators are about 5 years older on average than a member of the House of Representatives. So That doesn't look a lot like the United States either, although in some ways it does because of baby boomers, which are now in their 50s. The very bottom end of baby boomers are in their 50s, but the bulk of them are now roughly around 60 years old. But even with that, obviously, there's more young people, many more years below it. But I don't know if that makes them not representative of younger people. You could make the argument that it does, but maybe it doesn't matter as much at some levels too. In terms of occupation, of course, we see a skewing on this as well. We don't have percentages here, but you get an idea of what the big ones are, right? Business and professional sort of public service in various ways, whether it's working in the public sector or actually being involved in politics. Our big ones, law is a massive one as well. More than half the Senate actually are in the law business. So on the Senate side, we see a lot more sort of legally focused people as well. So you get some idea of where the vast majority of people come from. There are some obviously overlap on this where people might be in multiple categories. So you got to take a look at that and get a sense of it when you're looking at it. We can look at education. There's obviously a skew towards education, even though most people would have below the educational attainment of an average House member. Only 21 members of the House and one senator have no educational degree beyond a high school diploma. That's a very small amount, 1% of the Senate, and probably, I have to run the numbers, but 2% maybe at the most of the House, where the vast majority of Americans have nothing more than a high school diploma or maybe a 2-year degree, but only about, I think it's 30% have a bachelor's degree of the U.S. population. So in terms of education, we skewed, but you may not be bothered by that, and that would be okay. We need people with different educational attainments and different educational focus to do a variety of things, and we would hope that our members of the House of Representatives would be able to have some skills based off that. We see associate degrees, how that breaks down, whatnot. Some of the high degree, right, master's degree, 85 members of the House and 14 senators, law degrees, which is what we would call a terminal degree in the law profession as well, and various kinds of other law degrees, right? 20 representatives and no senators have a PhD. That's like an academic type degree. And then there's a handful of senators and about the same amount as PhDs have medical degrees in that. So we have some doctors. Within that, we've talked about one in class in particular, Rand Paul, who's considered a candidate for the Republican nomination for president, or is positioning himself to be so, from Kentucky, is a doctor. People sometimes focus on that. We talked about in one of my sections today about another person who announced their candidacy for president or on the verge of doing so, Ben Carson, who has a medical degree. He's not a senator, Rand Paul is, but just we do sometimes elect people that have medical degrees. We can also look at length of service. This is not so much a representation stuff, but it gives you an idea of what Congress looks like. And I think when you look at these numbers, you might find yourself sort of surprised a little bit. Because we often think that they spend 50 years on average in there, but really it's much shorter. Remember, the House of Representatives, which is this part here, is serve 2-year terms. So every 2 years they get reelected. Senators, if you're elected just once, you serve 6 years. So in terms of the most recent Congress, 9.1 years is the average stay of a member of the House of Representatives, right? That's 4.5 terms. That means you ran for office 4 times, which doesn't sound like a lot. That's not a long period of time, less than 10 years, almost just barely 9 years, in fact. On the Senate side, same kind of thing, like less than 2 terms. The average senator only runs twice, once to get initially elected and once for re-election on average. And those numbers seem to be going down. There has been a trend in the United States recently, mostly because of just the inability to legislate and the contentiousness of Congress for people who would normally be easily reelected to decide not to run again. They just don't enjoy the activity of the work and don't feel like they're contributing in any significant way. And so we've seen a trend on that. And certainly on the Senate side, that seems like a pretty precipitous drop from the average of 13 years to 10 years over about a 6-year period. And then a couple other things too. We get a look at religion, right? When we look at this, more than half the members are Protestant in the House of Representatives, and out of those Protestant denominations, which are basically any Christian religion any mainstream Christian religion that's not Catholic. So they would not include. I don't think it includes things like Seventh Day Adventists or maybe it does, but it would not include Mormonism, for instance, within those numbers. And you get an idea. So that's 60% of both houses combined, but you can see what the numbers look like by each house. We get about 30% are Catholic, and about 6% are Jewish. And that's again for all members, so 535 put all together. So on the Senate side, about 11% are Jewish, so a little higher than 6%, a little lower on the House side as well. We can see Mormons, right, make up. We have 8 in the House and 7 in the Senate. And again, these numbers are slightly old, so this does not reflect the most recent election when you're looking at it. And then we can look at some other stuff. We have some Buddhists, we have some Muslims, we have a Hindi, excuse me, and then we see other kinds of various affiliations. And of course, there's atheists that belong too, although not very many. I'm trying to think of one that might even be a declared atheist. It's actually one of the hardest things to run. You're more likely to win an election as a Muslim than you are as an atheist. Believing, very much observers would say, is more important than not believing. What God you believe in is not as important as making sure that you believe at some level. In the United States, that's certainly the case. Finally, what I want to talk about, this is sort of the bleed into what was my lecture in class, which is how does representation work in the United States? And there's 3 things you need to pay attention to within this. First of all, we see single member districts. Our members of Congress are single members from a geographic district, right? So a member of the House represents people within a defined geographic center. It only has one person who represents that geographic location, as opposed to some models which would have multiple members representing them. We also have what's called winner-take-all elections. And winner-take-all elections means as long as you win by one vote, you win the whole thing, which is tied to the fact you're only electing one person. In most cases, we also have what's called plurality elections, which means you don't even have to win 50% of the vote. You just need to win the most votes. So if 3 people are running and one person gets 40% of the vote and the other 2 people each get 30% of the vote, which together is 100% of the vote, the person with the 40% of the vote would win the election, even though most people voted against them, if that makes sense. So winner-take-all elections. And then finally, we have a geographic basis for representation, as opposed to a broad and non-geographic base. All of these things together define our type of representation, and it just so happens that these kinds of things also come together to help maintain the 2-party system of politics, okay? But mainly this kind of thing also adds to why members act the way they act. In this particular case, they're constantly trying to expand the number of people that are going to vote for them. They're paying attention to those people within their geography. And so you get an idea of how this defines the nature of a representation. That wraps up the video collection, and you can then transfer this into your notes on what I started with on Congress.